at Maestro, we focus super heavily on the details of the customer experience that our clients intend their product to deliver to their customers. What that means is we want to understand, what does that mean in terms of metrics that we can sort of track and measure and engineer against. And once we have our hands around what the core experiences are and what the most important experiences are, then we'll apply engineering fundamentals. We get back to first principles and really focus on designing the specific bits that deliver those experiences. And we move very quickly, as we're often building, a lot of physical prototypes. Once we have an understanding of how to deliver those core experiences, then we start packaging up those bits of design into a product embodiment.
You're listening to another episode of the Next Generation Design Podcast. I'm your host, Greg Arnott. On today's episode, I'm joined by Joe Moak, founder and chief engineer at Maestro Product Design and senior product architect at Meta. Before we start, let's say hello to today's guest. Joe, welcome to the show.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me, Greg.
I'd like to begin by learning a little bit more about your company. What can you tell us about Maestro Product Design?
We're an experience-driven design and engineering company, meaning that we focus on sort of the details of the customer experience that our clients intend to deliver to their customers. And we do industrial design, product design engineering, and electrical engineering from concept all the way through high volume production.
You're the founder and chief engineer at Maestro. Can you tell our audience a bit more about your current role and how the company came to be?
It's kind of my company that I started from scratch. And man, if we go back far enough, when I was a grubby little 12-year-old riding dirt bikes out in the woods where I grew up, my family saved up and bought a Sony Sports Handycam. And I just remember being in awe of this object that, had never existed before and certainly existed now. There were all kinds of seals and mechanisms and motors. And I thought, man, this thing's really a work of art, and we can take it out into the woods and record ourselves being silly and having a good old time. And I want to make something that's this cool when I grow up, that enables people to, have similar joyful experiences. And, I started asking around in the rural community of origin where I grew up, and the best we could come up with was we thought mechanical engineers designed those kinds of things. And that's when I decided, okay, well, I guess I'll be a mechanical engineer, and studied mechanical engineering at Cal Poly, and then got myself a job in the medical device industry and worked there for just shy of a decade, and got into consumer products after that through Apple, and eventually decided that I would like to help as many organizations as I can achieve really aspiring goals when it comes to delivering really high quality hardware at really high volumes. And a consultancy seemed like the model that would best enable that kind of engagement. And that's where Maestro came from.
Well, it sounds like it was all meant to be. What have you learned over the course of your career as you've continually taken on ever more responsibility and ownership?
I started out my career, as most engineers do, sort of designing parts and maybe small subsystems. And over the course of my career, I just kept sort of taking on more and more ownership, kind of doing everything I could to influence and impact a positive outcome for customers of the hardware. And, eventually that meant that I was leading teams. That meant that I was building teams. That meant that, instead of spending a lot of my day working with kind of the cross-functional technical teams, I ended up working with, director level and even VP and C-suite level folks. And, I never necessarily sought or aspired to, own a company and build teams. It just, is sort of necessary to get the job done.
I'm curious, what kind of companies and clients is Maestro working with? Are there any specific industries that you specialize in?
We work across a breadth of industries, consumer products, of course. We do quite a bit of medical. We've even done some enterprise, and man, we even have an action sports type project in the portfolio as well. We typically find great partnerships with clients who are kind of aspiring to either level up their current product quality or like enter the market at kind of a higher premium price point. And they also want to get there quickly. And, we're able to engage across the entire development process. We're just as comfortable with a blank sheet of paper figuring out what a product and a company could be as we are in a factory dialing in and optimizing high volume production processes.
Being in such a fast evolving industry, I imagine you see many changing trends and challenges.
The trends and the challenges, fundamentally, they haven't changed much. There's this sort of thread of tension between design and manufactured reality, and there's a trick to managing the design and engineering teams to kind of reconcile manufactured reality with that design vision. It's really easy for teams, and I've seen this happen in many different organizations, many different teams, like regardless of industry, teams make a series of seemingly small decisions as they work their way through the process. And it's really easy to lose sight of the North Star and lose sight of some of the customer experience goals. And what ends up happening is after you go through that long process, what ends up coming off the production line falls short of the vision that we had when we started the program. It's kind of a death by 1,000 paper cuts situation. And, we put a lot of effort into understanding how every decision is going to affect the customer experience, no matter how small it may seem.
I really like that analogy. Now, it's been years since I was an electronic engineer, but I remember appreciating how each individual cog in the wheel is doing their very best to deliver their bit to perfection without necessarily having sight of the overall vision that they're driving toward.
Yeah, that's 100% correct. And it's often not because the engineers are bad or that the designers are bad or that they're trying to make things worse. Most often it's sort of a lack of understanding, a lack of product context. And again, it just requires, good sort of oversight and leadership to make sure that those team members are equipped with that context when they're doing their work.
Joe, I'd like to switch gears and talk a bit about CAD. Can you tell our listeners how you were first introduced to CAD software?
I was first introduced to CAD, I think in 1988, running CAD Key on MS-DOS, probably version 3. Not that anyone cares. The gray in the beard is real, man. I've been here for a while. And I've used over a dozen different CAD packages. When I say used, I've designed parts and made parts in at least a dozen different packages.
And do you remember when and how you were first introduced to Siemens NX?
I started using NX in 2006 when I joined Apple. And I remember my first NX training session with Steve at Design Visionaries. And it seemed about the same as what I was using previously. And after about 6 months at Apple, I started to get the hang of it. And in about 9 months, I felt like my hands weren't tied behind my back anymore. And I've never looked back.
Sounds like you've got quite a few years of experience under your belt. Do you have any advice for someone trying to learn NX or CAD software for the first time?
First thing is just jump into NX if you can. I know that NX may have a reputation for being expensive, and that's lately not necessarily the case. It's a great tool. When you're using NX, embrace the history-based modeling and the direct modeling. That's one of NX's superpowers. Don't be afraid of that remove parameters command either as you get into it.
At Siemens, we like to say that NX is at the heart of the most comprehensive digital twin. From your perspective, what does the digital twin mean to you, and how is it impactful?
I know that there's a sort of an industry definition around digital twin that is, something like, you've got a simulation or a model of a factory, and then you've got a factory running, and you're sending inputs, from sensors in the factory to your model, so you can kind of watch the simulation run in real time. In the world that I live in, where we're doing these electronics products, we typically don't get that sophisticated with digital twins, but for the longest time, I've considered my simulation models a type of a digital twin, in that we've got multi-physics being applied to these products that we're designing, sort of representing loading conditions and thermal conditions, and sometimes even abusive conditions.
Yeah, bringing multiphysics into simulation can get pretty hairy. Taking a bit of a step back, can you tell me a little bit more about the overall design process at Maestro? What's it like, and how do things start once you get a client?
We have a bit of a unique process at Maestro in that we focus super heavily on the details of the customer experience that our clients intend their product to deliver to their customers. And what that means is we want to understand, when a client says that something needs to be tactile, for example, what does that mean in terms of metrics that we can sort of track and measure and engineer against? And once we have our hands around what the core experiences are and what the most important experiences are, then we'll apply engineering fundamentals. We get back to first principles and really focus on, designing the specific bits that deliver those experiences. And we move very quickly, as we're often building, a lot of physical prototypes, and we call them test box. And once we have an understanding of how to deliver those core experiences, then we start packaging up those bits of design into a product embodiment. And then at that point, the process looks very similar to processes you might see at other consumer product companies, where we're, doing kind of a proto phase, EBT phase, DBT phase, and PBT phase.
And if somebody does want something tactile, what does that entail?
There are just so many factors that affect tactility. I've got 100 slides on all of these little elements. So zooming way out, I'll pick an example of like a button. If a product is otherwise sort of looking and feeling great, and you squeeze a button or you press a button and it feels mushy, then your understanding of the value of that product has been degraded, right? And oftentimes irreparably. So when we're thinking about button tactility, we're thinking about sort of click ratios and button travel and button stability and fit and finish of the button. So there are a lot of different elements, but the engineer in me, my head immediately goes to the sort of the force deflection response, and how does that click curve look, and how does it feel?
That's fascinating. I'd never really considered how tactility is actually a key part of a product's value. Can you tell us more about the benefits you and your designers have seen using NXCAD?
There's a lot. The first thing that comes to mind is the hybrid modeling that we're able to do in NX, where we're able to use sort of the parametric history-based tools right alongside the direct modeling tools. I find that incredibly enabling, certainly in early phases of architecture where we're trying to understand the design space. It ends up speeding up the development, even though the CAD practices might make folks who are comfortable with direct or with parametric tools cringe a little bit, because I'm removing parameters all the time and extruding edges and thickening and replacing faces, but it's just incredibly fast. Another really unique feature of NX is the round tripping that we can do between industrial design and engineering. The CV and whole structures of surfaces are maintained when I'm collaborating with folks using other surfacing tools. Alias, for example, a Black Diamond, when we were designing a carabiner, the designer would send me their proposal, and then I would run structural simulations on the form, and I could actually push and pull the control vertices of the surface to get the stress to flow in a manner that achieved our strength goals. And then the designer could go back in and using those same surface definitions, kind of massage the surface so that it looked nice and not just performed well. And so a few cycles back and forth, again, like using the exact same surface data, we were able to really quickly land a form that was both performant and aesthetic.
Do you find that NX helps with taming product complexity and achieving that overall design vision?
It just comes back to that flexibility. Again, in the early stages of architecture, I'll often build models that have parametric relationships that are sort of engineering driven or kind of calculation driven and model driven among different parts in the assembly. And it's super easy to manage all of those interdependencies in one file. And then as the team grows and we need to kind of start dividing up the work and giving ownership of subsystems and parts to other engineers, it's super simple to take that master file and kind of parse out the individual components into their individual files and enable each of the engineers on the team to take ownership while sort of maintaining just enough of the interdependencies that we're building robust models without being sort of overburdened with model maintenance.
Can you help our listeners understand how important it is for you to have flexibility in the architectural design phases?
It's absolutely critical. Like having used NX for as long as I have, and then, being in situations, certainly with client work, where clients require us to use a different CAD package and deliver native files in a different CAD package. The history-based modeling ends up being incredibly constraining, certainly in the architectural phases. I mentioned before, I'm almost thinking of product architectures in terms of like datum surfaces and clearances and being able to grab surfaces and push them and pull them and move them around and being able to replace faces. They're just, until you see them, it's difficult to describe it. They're just incredibly powerful commands that enable us to move incredibly quickly. We also end up leveraging a ton of vendor CAD, right? Like you download a step file of a connector from Molex. Being able to grab the well-defined surfaces in those models and leverage them without building any additional parametrics ends up being incredibly enabling. Another element of NX that I find incredibly flexible, and I mentioned this before, is that notion of like multi-body part files where you can build in all the parametrics you want as you're figuring out system interactions and then being able to quickly parse out those parts later. I've done similar in several other CAD packages, and it's always more onerous in those other CAD packages. It's just, way simpler and more sort of robust in NX.
Well, we're always delighted to hear when NX empowers our customers to do more. Are you leveraging the simulation and the 3D visualization tools within NX? And how do those help in the design process?
Oh, for sure. We use them super early in the design process to kind of validate our designs. We're really good at coming up with lots of ideas that may be good or may be bad, and understanding how a product might perform sort of structurally and thermally is really important. Later in the process, we're using those same tools to optimize for strength and weight, and certainly thermal performance and cost. Those two tend to often be at odds.
There's been quite a bit of excitement about the announcement of collaboration between Sony and Siemens that we talked about earlier this season. Do you think you'll be able to leverage the upcoming NX Immersive Designer software?
Oh yeah, absolutely. It's something that I've been dreaming of for a long time. We often talk about CAD goggles, and that's this situation where you've been staring at a CAD model for a long time, and then you send off a part to get machined or printed or otherwise prototyped, and you get the part back, and it's either enormous and you're surprised at how massive it is, or you get it back and it's super tiny. So just being able to hit the show me the real size button and have it there in front of you is, I think, a game changer. And I'm super excited about this notion of collaborative design reviews and being able to sort of share one model, one-to-one scale in the same space with other collaborators who may even be remote. So much of the work that we do now, and sort of the processes that we use now really require, real humans to be in the same physical space as the real parts, to really understand how things are working and how they're not working.
In addition to NX for CAD, what other Siemens software products are you using in your design process?
Yeah, in addition to the tools built into NX, we also use SimCenter 3D. Find the solvers there a little bit more robust, get a little bit more control over the boundary conditions, and can kind of fine tune the outputs.
Joe, before I let you go, I'd like to look into the future a bit and talk about some of the trending topics in your area of expertise. How do you see industrial and product design evolving, and what do you anticipate there?
Certainly the tools and the processes seem to lag other industries a little bit, but I'm expecting to see the tools evolve to, maybe some better interoperability. NX is great for interoperability, but I know some of my friends using other packages have had some struggles. There's something about the cloud in there. We're seeing some CAD tools now that are storing the CAD data offsite in the cloud, and the client is sort of a thin client on the machine. It'll be interesting to see how those tools fare on a long timeline. Those are the big ideas around tools that I think I expect. I'm a bit of a Luddite, and I tend to use the tools that are working right now. That's what's coming to mind in terms of tools. Well, I know we're already seeing some acceleration in manufacturing. For example, 3D printed sintered metal parts. The cost is coming down. We used to use those processes to make tooling in some of the medical devices that we build. Now the prices are coming down enough that you can almost put those parts into products, depending on your overall volumes. So I'm really excited about new manufacturing technologies.
One trend that's really close to my heart is sustainability. I imagine this is an interesting one for you. Are you able to design with sustainability in mind?
I worked on the first Mac Mini at Apple that made it to the EPEAT Gold status. I actually put quite a bit of effort into not just material selection. I mean, obviously material selection is important. There are material suppliers making better and better resins that represent sort of a closed loop, like post-consumer recycled products that are performing better, sort of engineered resins compared to how they performed in the past. It's pretty common for a while that any sort of recycled material or material with significant amounts of post-consumer recycled content had a significant degradation in mechanical properties and cosmetic properties, but it's not necessarily the case anymore. We're also thinking about sort of the life of the product after it leaves the customer's hands, and what we can do by design to enable sort of reuse of those materials in the future. So, they're thinking about how a service depot is going to easily separate the metal parts and the plastic parts so that those two materials can go into those recycle streams is really important. those are kind of the two big things. It's, enabling the recycling and, you leveraging the eco-friendly materials to the extent we can.
Maybe the most prominent trending topic right now is AI. We explored it in a previous episode of the Next Generation Design podcast, but I wonder how you put it to use in your work at Maestro.
I'm definitely not a power user of AI. I found it most useful recently, sort of as a research tool. I'm sort of hitting AI first, using the large language models to do research, and then kind of validating the research with Google. That tends to be the workflow now. It's pretty interesting. I found that, previously my research had been mostly thinking about the questions that I had, thinking about the domain I was trying to understand and boil it down to, single line questions that I could punch into Google. I feel like the AI tools make it sort of more conversational, and there's just a higher bandwidth of information transfer. It tends to make the research go more quickly.
Well, using AI to accelerate your research is a perfectly valid use case. If I can ask you to make a prediction, what do you see as the future or the next generation of design? What does that look like to you?
My observation has been the manufacturing world and the design world are connecting in new and different ways. When I started my career, it was a bit of a challenge to sort of get engagement from manufacturing as a design engineer. I have to often get in my car and drive to a shop to talk to a machinist, right? Or drive to a factory and talk to a tool maker, or, get on an airplane, right? And because manufacturing is sort of scaling and proliferating and becoming a little bit more democratized, and the tools of design are also proliferating and becoming a little bit more democratized. My observation has been that the folks designing the parts, professionals and amateurs, are able to engage sort of more effectively, more easily with folks making the parts. And I really like this theme. It seems like the merging of design and of manufacturing with engineering there in the middle, kind of reconciling the goals of each. I just expect that whole process to become, a little bit more effective over time.
Joe, one last question before we say goodbye. I know you've worn a lot of hats in your career, so I wonder, is there any advice you would give to someone starting out in their engineering career, and any entrepreneurial advice for up-and-coming startup founders?
I'm speaking from the perspective of a product design engineer. Of course, I don't know if this is true of engineers designing rocket engines. I'm sure there's some similarities, but so much of the work that I do, and so much of think about the CAD that I own, the designs that I end up owning. Many of the details are driven by the needs of my cross-functional team members. Certainly these highly integrated electronics products that have lots of features have many stakeholders. And, it's really important that we're providing mechanical designs that enable each of those technologies to operate well. And I'm often not the expert on all of those things. As a matter of fact, I'm not the expert on any of those technologies. Certainly, you're thinking about RF and circuit boards and displays and microphones and buttons. I know how to integrate all of those technologies, but I end up having these really deep relationships with each of these cross-functional team members. So the advice is just get comfortable having technical conversations with designers and engineers and marketers and leaders from different domains, and spend the time to understand the language. Often, we use different words to express the same ideas. Sometimes ideas in their domain don't actually exist in our domain, so it takes some time to understand those ideas. If nothing else, that's super important. Entrepreneurial advice, that's a tough one. I'm kind of a shoot first, ask questions later, take action first, ask questions later kind of a guy. I guess my entrepreneurial advice is make sure that you get paid before you pay. Certainly starting out, manage your cash flow, put a lot of effort into knowing where your money's coming from and where it's going.
That's great advice. Thanks so much for that, and thank you for your time today. It's been a real pleasure learning more about Maestro Product Design and the work that you and the company do. Thanks again to Joe. We look forward to having you back again soon. Thanks also to our listeners for tuning into today's episode. Join us again next time for more discussions about the latest in design innovation and software applications. If you haven't already, please consider subscribing to our podcast on your favorite platform. And if you're enjoying the content, please leave us a review. I'm your host, Greg Arnott, and this has been the Next Generation Design Podcast.